Hi everyone, in my last video I was talking about what an f-stop is and how that relates to aperture. In this video we are talking about depth of field, and that is also slightly related to aperture. Depth of field, also known as your DOF, so you might see people abbreviate it such as DOF, is the depth of field. So what that means is how much sharpness of a picture that you get in your photo. Depth of field is measured just by like how you'd measure anything, like with a ruler, whatever. And there's two types. You either have shallow depth of field or you have a great big depth of field. If you have a great big depth of field, everything from very close to very far away is all in sharp focus. If you have a very shallow depth of field, then only a small part of it will be in focus, or it'll be sharp. The rest will be all blurry. Now, first of all, I have to tell you, without a doubt, depth of field does not change if you're shooting on a crop censored camera or a full frame camera. Actual depth of field does not change. No argument about it, it's a fact. If I'm shooting straight onto a person and let's say I'm shooting with a 85mm f1.4, and if I'm shooting at 1.4 and I'm a certain distance away and the depth of field is from my nose to my ears, meanwhile the back of my head is kind of blurry, if I go from a crop framed sensor to a full frame sensor, the depth of field will not change. It will not suddenly become a smaller part of my face that will be in focus. The actual distance front to back will still be the same distance. It does not change with your crop sensor. That also goes the same when you're talking about focal length. Focal length doesn't actually change when you go from a full frame to a crop sensor. Only your idea of focal length changes. For example, it's the same as putting a toilet roll holder up to your eye. It's not all of a sudden you've got telephoto vision, you're just cropping out most of the stuff which you can't see around the side. So anyway, depth of field is all about what's blurry and what's in sharp focus. Shallow depth of field you get by having a very wide aperture. So an f1.4, f1.2, f2.8 is obviously a more shallow depth of field than an f5.6. It is also controlled about the length of your lens. For example, if we look at the computer just now, I've taken a picture of Mr. Hippo in the living room, and if you look at the background here, we've got a candle against the window. And if we look at the photo beforehand, this photo here, notice the background is more blurry. And the more blurry, well, the blur we actually call a bokeh or a bokeh. B-O-K-E-H. I think it's a Japanese word, but I would probably just say like bokeh, like a bouquet of flowers, but that's probably not exactly correct. And if you look here, the bokeh is different, even though these were both shot at f4.8. But what the difference is I shot one with a 50mm lens and the other with a 100mm lens, both in exactly the same position. The 100mm lens, being double the length of the 50mm lens, makes the background more blurry than the 50mm does. So if you're at the same distance as someone with a shorter focal length, the longer focal length will have a shorter depth of field. So if you're looking at these photos again, the actual sharpness is fully taking up all of Mr. Hippo. There's no doubt about it. As you can see, he's fully in focus. But what if you look closer at the, say, the front of the couch here, with the 100mm lens, that's already becoming blur. With the 50mm lens, that is still fairly sharp. Now what I've actually done is I've cropped this from the 50mm because that was actually the size of the 50mm lens. If on Lightroom I show you both of these pictures by pressing N, oh no, if I go into the library and I press N, then those are the two photos from the camera being in exactly the same position. The one on the left is the 100mm lens, the one on the right is the 50mm lens. So the 50mm is looks like a wider angle shot. The 50mm, also with it being a shorter millimeter, shorter length, at the same aperture, effectively it has a larger depth of field. And it does. It has an actually larger depth of field. If you were to take a measuring tape out, you see it's maybe 40 centimeters compared to the 100mm, which is looking maybe it's only about maybe 10 or 15 centimeters. Depth of field is also controlled about how close you are to the subject. So the closer you are, the shallower the depth of field at the same aperture than if you're further away. So that is what depth of field is, DOF. DOF is how much of your picture is sharp, and that is controlled by the length of your lens, the aperture, and the distance of the subject to yourself, or to the lens, as it were. Nothing to do with the size of the sensor in your camera. Hope that helps. If you disagree, please put it down below, but I promise you the actual depth of field does not change. Thank you very much. Bye bye.